We asked the question, is it time to declare a state of national disaster because of the occurrences happening at Eskom? Energy expert Mohamed Madhi is joining me now. We hope to have economist Owen Nkomo as well come on if he's not going through load shedding at this particular point in time. But Mohamed, good evening and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus. I mean, that is the question. Are we at that point where we would need to declare a state of national disaster? Eskom is too big to fail, but it keeps on failing. And maybe when we put regulations in place like we did with the COVID-19, we'll be able to put together a command team there at Eskom that gives us daily briefings, that lifts particular restrictions, that allows certain things to happen that will fix and sort out that utility and move it forward.
So, good evening, first of all, and good evening to all the viewers. Look, the problem is a lot deeper than just, putting in place a command council and that. Those kind of things do help. But remember, it's not, as much as the current leadership is not the kind of leadership I would expect should be leading a utility that must be in transition. As much as that is the case, this is a problem that is deep-rooted and it's been building for several years, if not decades. And we are now at that point where we're dealing with the situation with regard to an aging infrastructure. That aging infrastructure comes with its own set of problems, and this is completely predictable. So that is the one thing that I would hold against, the entities and the decision makers at Eskom. It's pointless coming onto the media and apologizing for individual events. The fact is that Eskom needs to come clean and point out to the South African public that this is the state exactly of our power stations, of the aging infrastructure, and you can expect that this will continue to happen. And unfortunately, it will continue to happen because that is the nature of capital equipment, power generation equipment, when it comes close to end of life. You have a lot more what's called unplanned breakdowns, unplanned maintenance, etc., unplanned outages, and this is what's going to go on. So even if we change the leadership, we need to address the fact that we have aging infrastructure. And it was a state of emergency a while ago with regard to power. Can you imagine we have close to 40% of the capacity of this total generation fleet unavailable at certain points in time? This has never happened before. It's clearly an emergency situation.
Yeah. If you look at that record, many that are looking at of the amounts of blackouts that we've had under the leadership of Andre de Ruyter, at some point amounting to over 2,000 blackout hours, that people are counting. Is that a fault of his, or is it because when he came in, the system had degenerated to that level?
Yeah, I think it's really unfair to consider that, the current leadership, it's their fault. I think they could have done more, and they could have certainly come cleaner with regard to where we are and being more transparent to the public. But you can't really blame them for a problem, as I said, that's been building up for a long period of time. And also, look, these are functionaries. These are functionaries within the utility, these individuals. They report to a shareholder, and the shareholder is responsible for policy. And that policy needs to be addressed. That policy needs to be fixed. And that policy is much wider than just Eskom. It's the whole energy supply and energy generation industry in this country and how we go about fixing that. And, a really, really striking example of the problem we face is when foreign countries announce that they're going to offer certain amounts of money to us to build infrastructure, we are delighted, and it's headline news everywhere. But on a daily basis, when the private sector in this country is offering to put in tons of money, if they are given the freedom to build power plants in a manner that is more efficient, that is more in line with what this country needs, all kinds of roadblocks are put in place. So we need to address that. In both instances, you have parties that are willing to come to the table and put money up, try and solve the problem. In one case, it's discouraged, and in the case where it should be discouraged, it is encouraged. And that is part of the problem, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, would something like a declaration of a national state of disaster not assist with things like that? Where we saw, for example, with COVID-19, certain restrictions were lifted. Private sector was allowed to play a role, make a contribution. A fund was created. Things began to happen where there was a collaboration. And to an extent, one would say there was a degree of success in how we handled the pandemic.
Sure, absolutely. And I think the parties involved there, Dr. Madhi, etc., have done a great job. But in the case of power, we should declare some sort of, emergency intervention, if not necessarily a state of emergency. But the last thing I want is for funds to be collected and to be managed and handled by the state or by Eskom. So that's not the solution. We need to have a regulatory regime put in place very quickly. If anything, we need an emergency state of policy making so that the policy can be set up in such a way that it enables those parties that can contribute to the solution to do so efficiently. What I think we must really guard against is an ailing, technically almost knocked out utility been given the opportunity to now get a whole bunch of funds and try and solve the problem. They're clearly not capable of solving the problem. And we do need different leadership, but for not the reasons that you've mentioned, to address this problem.
Owen Nkomo is joining us on the line. Owen, good to have you with us. Your colleagues in business are calling for heads to roll. In fact, they want CEO Andre de Ruyter along with his board to step down, to resign, because, to use their words, the utility is inept and out of depth, at least the leadership at the helm. What's your feeling?
Look, I'm not sure that it's... I want to try and be unbiased around this one. I think that, it's like when you watch the English Football League and you get a coach being given one season to sort things out for a team that's been failing for a long time. I doubt that is actually the right approach. Maybe we need to give him enough time for him to implement his strategies, but importantly for the government to make sure that they support Andre de Ruyter. And importantly, I think if you get rid of government interference at Eskom, just like we had limited government interference at Telkom when Telkom got privatized, for one reason, I do think that Eskom will probably come right. But if we're going to chop and change managers, I don't believe that we're going to be able to stick to the structural plans that have been made for Eskom to recover. We certainly all want electricity back. As I speak to you, I'm in the dark and forward, so I can't see anything. So it's not a pleasant environment to live under, and it's certainly not investor friendly.
Emergency state of policy making, Mohamed suggests, because ideally, I suppose what you want is to assist this power utility that currently is giving us below 50% capacity of what it should be giving us at 100%. And it's continually and consistently doing that. And there is, at this particular point, not even a prospect of getting that capacity up. Even with the new power stations in there, also failing consistently. I mean, would a lifting of restrictions immediately on IPPs and allow industry, for example, to feed into the grid mines which produce excess power and so on and so forth, and maybe even remove some of the tariffs on imports of equipment that is immediately needed to help us move into that particular space? Owen?
Sir, look, the sad thing about the IPP conversation, in my view, is the fact that it took forever for the government to allow these guys to start supplying into the grid. And I think we need as much power supplies as possible to probably come through from alternative suppliers of energy other than Eskom. The private sector, in my view, can mobilize electricity quite fast. But I'll tell you what the sad side of that is. The bulk of our communities are not going to be able to afford electricity that is privately produced. I mean, we've got a case where we're buying metered electricity at the moment. It's extremely expensive, double. And I think that, in my humble view, if there was anything I could say to President Ramaphosa, for his legacy to be remembered for something very useful. I do believe that he must just make Eskom his single priority, given the impact it's going to have on the country right now and going forward from what he started off doing when he was appointed to bring investors into the country. But right now, if you were to go outside the country and try and talk to investors and say, come and invest in the country, they'll probably laugh at his face. So he needs to throw in everything he can to sort out this Eskom mess, because it's a legacy that we could remember him for, because everything else just seems to be falling into pieces, honestly.
Here's what I'm going to do, Owen. I'm going to put you on the spot in a moment. When we come back from the break, I'm going to do something unconventional, step out of the driver's seat a little bit, because I know Mohamed wants to take you on what you just said right now. So I'm going to let you guys fight it out a little bit for 2 minutes at least. And, of course, we'll continue with the conversation. Energy expert Mohamed Madhi and economist Owen Nkomo there with us on the line. Do stay with us. In Focus continues in a moment. Back with you tonight on In Focus, Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. The conversation continues. The question we ask tonight, is it time to declare a state of national disaster with the continuing blackouts, rolling blackouts, with Eskom today announcing that they now will be moving into stage 4 of load shedding, at least until Friday at 5 a.m. Here's what business has been saying around the reaction to this.
Absolutely. As you know, it's been a very difficult 2 years for us. We've done everything to try and survive so many parts of COVID. Now we are back on trying to survive the load shedding. We certainly have called to landlords that they have a responsibility and an onus on the lease to actually provide alternative energy solutions. And we've also called on the landlords to put pressure that Eskom needs to take responsibility for the situation. There are very many clever ways to spread the load shedding at different times where it doesn't have impact on businesses, but to not properly consult with us to understand when it's most essential for us to be able to use it is really definitely putting pressure on our industry. What we have seen is that obviously larger restaurants have put in the infrastructure to be able to set up generators, but it's costly. So the financial cost on our businesses is paramount. So it's not as simple as just saying, well, we have a generator, we can continue to trade. The cost to run that generator is extremely high. And that has huge financial impacts on our restaurants.
That's reaction from the restaurant sector. Energy expert Mohamed Madhi and economist Owen Nkomo still with us on the conversation. So, Mohamed, as I mentioned, I'll let you take that on, the view by economist Owen Nkomo. But also the restaurants, they're also saying, even for business, alternative energy solutions are costly. But Owen raising an even harder question of the majority of the poor will not be able to afford electricity should indeed we pursue the route of IPPs.
Okay, so let's just address the restaurant issue. I think what the spokesperson was saying is that running diesel generators is expensive, and that's true. Doesn't mean that all forms of alternative energy are expensive. In fact, renewable energy plants, on-site renewable energy plants, are actually cheaper in many, many cases than Eskom tariffs. So that's the first point. With regard to the poor not being able to afford this, let me tell you, I've been a power station engineer at Eskom a long time ago, and I've also been head of Eskom's electrification program in the northern, southern, eastern, western Cape. And, this was 25 years ago. And we electrified a large part of this country. And what helped was the policy regime. So today, when we talk about IPPs, people immediately get scared about the tariffs. Remember, we're saying allow IPPs to build the plants and to generate power and to sell the power. But we're not saying that you must allow the IPPs to have carte blanche when it comes to the tariffs. NERSA is still there, and NERSA will still determine the tariffs. And NERSA will still have that oversight responsibility for ensuring a fair and just and equitable tariff structure across the country for the different kinds of users. So that will not be affected, and we must separate these issues. This always comes up, and I think because not necessarily with Owen, but generally there is a confusion about IPPs, and then immediately people jump to the conclusion that you're going to have carte blanche for the tariffs.
Yeah.
Just to repeat, NERSA will always be there, or should be there for the short term anyway, to oversee those tariffs.
Don't be afraid of the tariffs, Owen Nkomo.
No, look, it's like the numbers should always do the speaking when I brought up. We're battling at the moment already with people failing to pay Eskom at current rates that are relatively accommodative. And I think that if we were to go private, if we were to even maybe probably get up to 20-25% of the electricity being supplied by the private sector, I have no doubt that we will see some sort of increase in the per kilowatt cost of electricity in the country. I mean, I was doing some research today. There's this lithium battery opportunity that is being marketed at the moment, where you can spend about 25,000 rands to get a lithium battery, set up in your house. I'm not an energy expert, but I was just trying to do this for my household. 25,000 rands, Tabo. And if you've got a gas stove, you probably should come all right. But how many households in the country can afford to put away 25,000 rands? And how long will it take for the government infrastructure and the private sector infrastructure to be rolled out in a quick enough time for us to make sure that the majority of people that are currently dependent on the public grid actually get sorted out in terms of electricity supply?
While COP26 negotiations are taking off in Glasgow, South Africa has secured a multi-billion-dollar deal with developed nations that is essential, they say, in curbing high emissions. Should we take this deal? Is part of the solution going to the developed nations and asking for money, or at least taking their money to wean us off coal? Owen?
Look, that is also a tough one. I mean, it obviously depends on how the deal is structured, what the deal will cost us. I am very weary of our continued failure to manage the infrastructure that we have, to deal with the problems that we have, to use the available cash resources that we have from our tax collection in order to prioritize dealing with our biggest issues, which is, in my humble view, is unemployment. We've got the highest unemployment in the country, and obviously energy supply to the national grid is a very big problem. In my view, our resources should be used to try and target dealing with those two major issues, Thabo. And I just think that this electricity crisis gives us even more problems in terms of trying to sort out the economy. But going out of the country to borrow money, in my view, is just adding on to our existing problems, Thabo. I believe we need to sort ourselves first. We are most likely going to get ourselves into problems by going on to get more debt structures into the national fiscus.
Mohamed, the politicians are saying it makes no sense that developed nations who for years have benefited from the use of coal, and now they are leaders in economies, they've got lots and lots of money, are now coming to South Africa and are saying, stop using your resources, we'll give you $131 billion and we are running, or 131 billion rands, I beg your pardon, and we are running to this.
So I agree again with Owen that we should not be taking this loan, with open hands, or even this grant, whatever terminology you want to use for it, because there's better ways of going about it. But in terms of the developed versus developing nations, in the past that argument was true. They certainly grew their economies and their infrastructure off the back of coal-fired power. Today, however, what's changed, and it changed since around 2019 when the inflection point occurred, is that a large number of renewable energy forms are actually cheaper than coal-fired power. So why on earth would you want to go back to coal-fired power when it's more expensive than renewable energy? It makes no sense. What we need to do is move to those forms of renewable energy that can ensure that we have lower tariffs. And to Owen's point earlier, I don't just research the stuff. We actually are in the trenches doing this. We've built power plants for the private sector at tariffs that are cheaper than Eskom. Power plants that are approved by NERSA, for example. So to assume again that tariffs are going to increase because it's in the hands of the private sector, the reverse is true actually. The coal-fired argument, again, in the past was true, but there are any number of technologies today that can give us baseload power. And then just touching on the other point that was made, the question was asked, how soon can we get this power out to those people that need it and to the private sector and so on. Look, we're not saying that Eskom must switch off immediately and that Eskom is, not needed on an immediate basis. Of course, there's got to be a phase out of Eskom or a phase out of Eskom's role currently, and it's got to be repurposed and restructured. But whatever the case might be, the private sector can do it a hell of a lot faster than Eskom and the government has been able to do it up to this point. I mean, we sit with an emergency procurement program that is not yet out of